I thought the dreams had stopped. How could that place have such power over me still? It's all so long ago now. But a few weeks ago, I had another one. So maybe it's finally time for me to take a look back. In the dream, I'm wandering through places I've never been, looking at landscapes I've never seen. Sometimes these imaginary places have existed before in earlier versions of the dream, but I never recognized them. I walk through the city, have dinner at restaurants, rehearse with some orchestra, never quite sure where I am, until, in a sudden rush of understanding, I realize I'm back in Bolivia. Then I wake up. Pregúntame dónde soy y no sé qué responder. Pregúntame dónde soy y no sé qué responder. De tanto no tener nada, no tengo de dónde ser. De tanto no tener nada, no tengo de dónde ser. Se va por el campo verde, harta sangre hay en el suelo. Yo no sabré pa' dónde voy, pero sé de dónde vengo. Yo no sabré pa' dónde voy, pero sé de dónde vengo. I've kept a list in my head of the most beautiful places on Earth. Of course, I haven't seen everything, but I've seen a lot. The Nepali cliffs on Kauai, the Urubamba Valley in Peru, the fjord at Sokotoppen on Greenland, the giant lobelia forests at the base of Mount Kenya, the Weddell Peninsula on Antarctica, as I saw it rising out of the fog. It's funny, though, I haven't put any place in Bolivia on that list. I guess because unconsciously I put the whole country in a different category. I had been living in New York, where over the course of 3 years, I'd come to believe that the world was nearly completely paved over, and that whenever you saw a bush or a patch of grass, it was just some place they forgot, like a potted plant on a fire escape, or one of those wilted trees that grow out of holes on Broadway. Summers in Colorado didn't really help. I'd look out from those rocky summits and swear I could see lines and lines of paving machines stretching from Nebraska to Kansas, rolling across the plains, paving everything in their path, on their way to pave over the Rockies. So I guess you could say what I loved about Bolivia was no pavement. Despite the altitude, I felt I could breathe again, even in a big city like La Paz. Big, yes, but no one actually knew how big. One day they held a census and said that on that day, anyone leaving their house would be arrested or shot. It made a kind of sense. How else were you going to count everyone with thousands of unnamed streets and unnumbered houses? On the day of the census, I stayed in practicing for a while, and then got curious and stuck my head out the gate in the hedge and saw that everyone was acting normally and no one was paying any attention to the census. We heard figures ranging from 500,000 to 1 million. Hey, I could have told them that. But somehow, all those houses and all those streets didn't bother me like New York. Well, for one thing, the houses were all adobe, which is just dirt. And except for paving stones in the center, the streets were all dirt. La Paz sits in a bowl cut out of the Altiplano, a huge dirt bowl filled with houses of dirt, streets of dirt. It was beautiful. I'm sure it's changed now. And that's part of why I can't go back. But hell, it was 1968. And the sky was so blue it was purple. And the only way to get around the country was in the back of a truck. I was in heaven.
Pollerita, pollerita de mi cholita,
Pollerita, pollerita colorosita,
que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con mi charanguito.
que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con mi charanguito. Saramanacutacu, mana trigo pelacu, mana chuyo pulpico.
Saramanacutacu, mana trigo pelaco, mana chuño púlpico. Que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con mi charanguito.
Que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con mi charanguito.
¡Alegría, alegría! Morenita, morenita de mis pasiones,
Morenita, morenita de mis favores,
para ti traigo las flores, pensamiento no me olvides, no me olvides.
no me olvides.
Para ti traigo las flores, pensamiento no me olvides, no me olvides.
No me olvides. Saramanacutacu, mana trigo pelacu, mana chuyo pulpico. Saramanacutacu, mana trigo pelacu, mana chuyo pulpico.
Que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con la llamerada.
Que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con la mirada. A mí no me gusta cuyahuada, a mí sí me gusta ya mirada. A mí no me gusta cuyahuada, a mí sí me gusta ya mirada. Saramanacutacu, mana trigo pelacu, mana chuyo pulpico. Saramanacutacu, mana trigo pelacu, mana chuyo pulpico.
Que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con mi charanguito.
que bien te bailas, que bien te cantas con mi charanguito. It was somehow inevitable that I go to South America. In 1962, I spent 9 months hitching around Europe, and my best friend was Sergio Ovalle, a Chilean. We've been friends ever since. I also hung out with a bunch of Paraguayans. We were always laughing. I knew right then that I wanted to go there. For the next 2 years, I struggled heroically and totally unsuccessfully to learn to play the bass. At the worst moments, I'd say to myself, okay, I'll give it another week, then I'm hitching to Chile. Those weeks kept piling up, despite my lack of progress, and I stayed put. Finally, I left Oberlin, found a teacher, spent a year practicing in Europe, and then entered Juilliard. I was focused and making progress when two huge things entered my life. One was climbing. I loved being in that vertical world. It became as important to me as music. I had to find a way to do both. And the other thing was the war in Vietnam. Juilliard was keeping me out, but it wouldn't last forever. I needed a plan. I was not going to war. The fall at Juilliard, before I'd even met Jimena, I saw a notice on the bulletin board. Peace Corps seeks musicians. Hey, that's a deferment. I read on. To play in National Symphony in La Paz, Bolivia, live at 12,000 feet. Bingo! Climb 20,000ers on weekends. Play in the orchestra. Stay out of the war in Vietnam. I called my rock climbing partner, Dave Austin. Said, Dave, we're going to Bolivia. But he wanted to finish his degree at Hart, and ultimately that made sense for me too. It ended up being 3 years to finish Juilliard, but nothing had changed my mind about going to Bolivia. However, Austin got married and didn't want to come along. I'd met an Argentine American with the oddly dispersed name of Maria Jimena Lasansky. We were living together in a desperate, dependent relationship, and she didn't want to come along either. A ballet dancer who, like me, had started very late. She was studying at Joffrey and had been promised an apprenticeship at Harkness for the following year. But we were too addicted to the tortures of the relationship, thought we couldn't live without each other, so we both applied to the Peace Corps. By this time, Gino Bauman, the director of Peace Corps in Bolivia, was sick of whining musicians and had no interest in ballet dancers. It took 6 months to change his mind. I'd already gotten my draft notice when Jerry Brown, the director of the orchestra in Bolivia, and also a Peace Corps volunteer and not a whiner, confronted Gino in his office with the Minister of Culture, Mario Estensoro, and his deputy, the director of music, Alberto Villalpando, in tow. They respectfully requested my presence in the orchestra as soon as possible. Gino was outmaneuvered, and he caved. Later, we got along fine. I called my parents and told them I was getting married next month, joining the Peace Corps, and going to Bolivia. That's nice, dear, my mom said. I never have been able to surprise her. Part of that was genetic. Her father, my grandfather, John R. Scottford, had gotten interested in South America and wanted to write about it. So he bought a camera, one of those large format things on legs, with a black cloth you put over your head, left his family in Cleveland, and toured South America for a year. He spent April 11th through April 23rd in Bolivia, 1928, and remembered it fondly. que la pena que mi alma lleva escondida.
Tropa, tropa. Aguanta.
Las escuelas que yo uso pa' mi floreo, alambiando reluces mi zapateo.
Solo haciendo en campo porque Dios piensa, porque Dios piensa. Que es cobarde quien hiere los indefensos.
Mira acá. Toro, toro, toro.
Y los pasos que pongo de cabecera, cavilando me tiene la noche entera.
Y en eso me sorprende la madrugada. Abrazado a quien llamo, mi peor es nada.
La tropilla que monto
de reservado. The National Symphony was a kind of miracle. It was sort of like an impressionist painting. You know how if you get too close to one, all you see are dots and splotches? Well, if you listen to each individual player in the orchestra, it was mainly splotches. But somehow, when we all played together, it coalesced into something better. On each instrument, there was one person who could actually play. Usually young, in their 20s, like me and Jerry. Ruben and Claudio, oboe and bassoon from Uruguay. Roy, Susan, and Rafael, violin, violoncello from the States. Roberto and Pablo, horn and flute from Argentina. Mike Fox was another Peace Corps volunteer who taught physics at the university, but also played trombone in the orchestra, and was my pianist in all the recitals that I gave in La Paz and around the country. Then there was Kurt Seville. I met him at Juilliard and dragged him along to be my climbing partner after I'd cleared the way with Gino Bauman. He played horn in the orchestra. That's him. The rest of the orchestra was made up of old guys who had taught themselves to play, and some young kids, like Freddie, Antonio, Wilfredo, Willie and his sister. Willie eventually married my sister. The amazing thing was that there was almost no rivalry between the three groups. The old guys were happy to fake along and have it sound good. The kids were glad to have teachers. And the first chair players like me were totally committed to making the whole thing work. I've since learned how unusual that was. We rehearsed every evening and gave concerts once a month. And with all that rehearsal, and because Jerry was an excellent conductor, the concert sounded surprisingly good. Audiences in La Paz were never what we hoped. At every concert, Senor Parra, one of the bass players, would stick his head out through the curtain. "How's the crowd?" I'd asked. "Cuatro gatos," 4 cats. But when we went on tour, everything was different. My first year, the orchestra went to Cochabamba. It's down around 8,000 feet, and with all the trees flowering and the bougainvillea everywhere, it was like a hothouse compared to La Paz. We played on a stage set up in the garden behind Los Portales, which was a mansion built by the Patiño family. They were tin barons, and they built a castle-like European mansion in Cochabamba before they took all their money and moved to Switzerland. Also a popular destination for Bolivian ex-presidents. So Portales had become a cultural foundation. We played 3 or 4 programs in that garden over the course of a week for huge, enthusiastic audiences. We played this piece, Lieutenant Quille, which we of course translated as Teniente Quispe. Quispe is like Smith among the Aymara Indians. We had a young horn player named Quispe in the horn section. So from then on, he was known as Teniente Quispe. Unfortunately, the tape of our performance did not survive. We also did a wonderful performance of Siegfried's Idol by Wagner, with just the first chair players. That tape is lost too. I'd give anything for a copy. After a great week in Cochabamba, we got on a bus with the basses and timpani tied on top and left for Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is down in the empty Mato Grosso country that continues off to the Brazilian border. An American embassy guy I met had taken the train, a wood-burning steam engine from Santa Cruz to Brazil, and been shot at by Indians with bows and arrows. I took that train when I left Bolivia and desperately wanted to be attacked, but it didn't happen. There's only one road from Cochabamba to Santa Cruz, and it winds down this enormous valley. And as a portent of things to come, it was paved. We're riding along, and one of the musicians asks El Hueso about an article he saw in the newspaper that morning. El Hueso's name was Hernanes Tensojo, but everyone called him El Hueso, the bone, because he was so skinny. Anyway, the article said that a town somewhere along the route to Santa Cruz was planning to blockade the road. No te preocupes. Don't worry, said El Hueso. And the next thing out of his mouth was usually, Paga el Ministerio. He was Vice Minister of Culture, and when we all went out for drinks, Paga el Ministerio, the ministry will pay, was exactly what we wanted to hear. And in this case, he just said, No te preocupes. And being Vice Minister of Culture, we figured he should know. Five or 6 hours later, we come to a huge line of trucks and buses, filling both lanes of traffic. We stopped behind them, and immediately some men with rifles tell us to stay put and not turn around. In a few minutes, that was impossible anyway, because other trucks and buses had pulled up next to us and behind us, and we were blocked in. Jerry immediately told everyone to set up for a concert on the road to show solidarity, plus maybe they would let us through. We played as it got dark. This piece, Trilogia India, and this is our recording. It was a huge crowd. There were over 600 trucks and buses stuck there. A radical Spanish priest, Padre Julio, who always had a cigarette in his mouth, and the mayor of the town, who always wore a white cowboy hat, had organized the blockade. Their town, which was a few miles up a side valley, had been petitioning the government for a water system for years, and after many broken promises, had taken action. They simply pulled a bunch of trucks filled with armed men across the road and refused to let anyone pass or turn around. Eventually, word got back to Cochabamba and Santa Cruz, and people stopped leaving, but those of us there already were stuck. After it was clear that we weren't going to get any kind of special treatment, we settled down and slept in the bus. In the morning, there were entrepreneurs selling eggs and rice cooked over wood fires, but food was relatively scarce. A bunch of us passed some time playing football down by the river. And after looking at the available drinking water, you could understand the town's frustration. That afternoon we spent in a bar playing sapo. We all drank coffee and tea because the blockade committee wouldn't let them sell beer. Mike Fox, the trombone player, and my piano accompanist, had never played sapo. It's a simple game. You toss these metal slugs at a board that has various holes that count for different points, and in the middle there's this bronze frog, the sapo. If you get a slug in the sapo's mouth, you win everything. When it was Mike's turn, he said, "What do I do?" "Just throw it in the sapo's mouth." So he did. He turns around and says, "You mean like that?" I know this happened because I was standing right next to him. water problem was so desperate that the committee would periodically send in a water truck, and everyone would line up with cans and jugs to get some. That night, Kurt came to me and said, "Dobbs, look what I got." He's hiding something. It's a dusty old can of sardines. He bargained for it at one of those little stores where they sell popcorn, toilet paper, and refrescos, and sometimes nothing else. "Kurt, you're not going to eat that. It's going to be great. Want to share it? I'm starving." "Those are like pre-Columbian sardines. They're going to make you sick." Kurt had a notoriously weak stomach and spent the whole night throwing up. A bunch of us finally located a boy who would sell us beer on the sly. There was always one. We sat out in the desert watching the sunset and drank beer from the bottle. The next day, I got this idea that maybe we could convince the committee to give us permission to go to the end of the line on the Santa Cruz side and hire someone to turn around and take us to Santa Cruz. It wasn't that I wanted to leave. I was enjoying myself immensely. But I needed some intrigue and wanted to hang out with the revolutionaries. So me and Alberto and Jerry started having these meetings with the Padre Julio and the mayor. They were really busy running things and trying to set up communications with the government back in La Paz. 2 days had passed, and they were holding over 1,000 people hostage, and commerce between two of the major cities in the country had been completely shut down. And still there was no sign of the police or the army. It was just a coincidence, but 2 years earlier, Che Guevara had been killed out in those hills, not more than a few miles away. In our final meeting with the committee, I presented the argument that because of our solidarity with their cause, we would be better utilized playing concerts in Santa Cruz and telling the people of their struggle. They finally agreed and would allow us to hire a vehicle and turn around, but we would have to sneak across the blockade line in the middle of the night so that other people didn't get the same idea. Alberto and I walked around on the other end and finally found this guy with an enormous truck who was willing to take us. Unfortunately, we didn't examine the back of the truck. Hey, it was late, it was dark, and we could see that it was big enough. Sometime around midnight, we organized the orchestra. People who play small instruments are rolling the timpani. Others are helping us to carry the basses by grabbing one end. It's fun. It's exciting. It's kind of like playing capture the flag, except the other team has guns. When we get to the truck, there's some grumbling about riding in the back. But for the most part, people are excited and grateful to us to be getting out of there. When someone says, "Que olor! What is that smell?" The driver had neglected to tell us that he'd been carrying a full load of hogs and had been unable to clean out the back. Ugh, it was disgusting. He's still protesting. "No es tan malo, it's not that bad," as we left and carried all our stuff back to the bus. Somewhere in the middle of that third night, the Siles Salinas government from La Paz, talking to the committee by shortwave radio, agreed to fund the water system and not to take reprisals against anyone for anything that had happened. In the morning, there was an announcement and a celebration. A band played, and there were some speeches. Jerry Brown made the best speech. Then the town presented him with a lariat and thanked us for the concert. The trucks with the men and rifles pulled off the road, and after some confusion, we all continued on our way. A few months later, Siles Salinas was touring that part of the country and was scheduled to be present for the groundbreaking of the water system. But it's dangerous for a Bolivian president to leave La Paz. And sure enough, while he was away, Colonel Ovando staged a coup. Siles Salinas fled to Chile, and I don't know if they ever got their water system. The orchestra was fun and satisfying, and we all felt that it got a little better every day. It was a lot, but it wasn't enough. Kurt and I were filled with the Peace Corps spirit and wanted to take music to the people. Shouldn't there be concerts on the Altiplano for the campesinos in the Indian villages? The paseños, the people from La Paz, just said, "Those indios would not understand anything like that." This, of course, just made us mad. The relationship between the indios and the blancos was complex. The Aymara-speaking Indians around La Paz and Quechua-speaking in other parts of Bolivia had a culture and lifestyle that had not changed very much since the Spanish invaded in the 1500s. But a lot of their music and dance was organized around making fun of the Spanish and now the blancos. There was this one dance that you could see at festivals called El Doctorcito, the little doctor, in which the dancers wore top hats and tails, danced with canes, and the best part, wore those glasses with fake noses and mustaches attached. They looked like a bunch of crazed Groucho Marxes. On the other hand, even though the blancos in the city patronized the cholos and cholas, who were their maids, servants, shopkeepers, etc., they were inordinately proud of the native food and native culture and music. In fact, the popular music of the day was just Indian music once removed, sung in Spanish, but since it was Aymaran rhythms, the emphasis was usually on the wrong syllable. But you could hear the real stuff still being created, too. One time I heard these two men, each playing a bass drum with one hand, a flute in the other, repeating a melody over and over of 10.5 beats. And they danced with it, and the music fit the dance. Bizarre. For our grand experiment of taking concerts to the Altiplano, we decided to begin in villages where there were Peace Corps volunteers, so that they could organize the concert and gather the audience. We invited Kurt's roommate Ted, who played some clarinet, Jimena's dance partner Humberto, put together a program, grabbed sleeping bags, and headed to the Altiplano. The Altiplano, or High Plain, stretches from Ecuador through Peru to Bolivia. It varies in altitude from 12,000 to 14,000 feet. It's hostile and beautiful. Our friends, the volunteers, would tell the villagers, "Viene un grupo de músicos de La Paz a tocar para ustedes." "Sí, caballero. It's tomorrow." "Sí, caballerito. You're coming, right?" "Sí." But come time for the concert, no one would be there. So Kurt began playing horn calls from the roof of the van. Sometimes I'd join him up there for our first piece, a Mozart duo. I remember one evening at dusk, and we're playing on top of the van in front of the church where we're going to perform later. We look out and see the hillside dotted with lanterns as the campesinos, heeding our call, are returning from their fields. Once everyone was gathered, we would play the Mozart duo, then a trio with clarinet, and then I would play that famous melody by Gluck from Orpheus, while Jimena and Umberto danced. Then, after a quick change, they would come out again as the Swan and the Prince, she in a tutu, he in tights. This alone was pretty overwhelming for a culture in which women wear 6 or 7 long skirts, and there was lots of laughter. But once the story started, something happened. I would narrate in Spanish, and usually someone would translate into Aymara, because many of the women did not understand Spanish. This is the story of a prince and a swan. A swan is a kind of duck, and the prince is in love with her, and they dance together. Now he's hiding behind a tree, and she can't see him. Umberto would crouch down behind an imaginary tree. And then Kurt and Ted and I would massacre Tchaikovsky with bass, horn, and clarinet. But when I looked out at those faces in the lantern light, I could see some magic happening, some essence of Tchaikovsky and Petipa coming alive in an adobe hut by the shore of Lake Titicaca. One of our friends told us later that she saw a young Cholita, thinking that she was alone, up on a wall, flapping her arms in that strange, stylized version of a bird she had never seen. Finally, the swan would die. We would end with some Bolivian cuecas, more laughter to see Jimena dressed as a Cholita. One time, we were performing outside in a little dirt square in front of the school. It was getting dark, and at 14,000 feet, it was cold. After the Orpheus melody, Jimena complained that she couldn't feel anything in her toes. We finished the concert, and then Kurt and I, the mountaineers, slowly warmed her feet. But she was never the same after that night. And after 2 trips to Washington, D.C. and 1 million doctor visits, she had to give up ballet forever. I became incredibly famous in Bolivia and could not walk down the street without being recognized, especially by urchin boys up in the markets. It all started when Bolivia opened its first TV station. The orchestra played at the inauguration, and the first transmission was viewed mainly by large crowds in front of the electronics stores. It was soon after that I played on El Show de los Sábados with my jazz group. It wasn't the jazz that made me famous. It was that we played this novelty number, Kunumisita, a Bolivian song, but I counted it off in Aymara. Amaya, apaya, amaya, paya, kimsa, pussy.
Amaya, apaya, amaya, apaya, kimsa, pussy.
I don't know how it happened, but somehow the word spread. And for the rest of my time in Bolivia, wherever I went, there'd be some boy yelling, Maya, Paya! Our name was famous too, the Tiwanaku Brass. Tiwanaku was the ancient pre-Columbian civilization in Bolivia, and it was a silly pun on the Tijuana Brass, who were popular in the States at the time, and whose music we hated. But everyone in Bolivia took it really seriously. The Tiwanaku Brass. Johnny Fisher, the drummer, and I thought it up as a joke. Johnny and I met the pianist Rene Calderon and the trumpet player Lucho Mejia at a New Year's Eve party somewhere. And then before we knew it, we made a record. Before we'd rehearsed or gotten used to each other or anything. The record went into production, and I started getting messages from Miguel Dueri, the owner of the company, asking for a name and a cover photo. I gave him the joke name and decided to organize a picture shoot. I had this idea that we would set up our instruments on a traffic island in the middle of Plaza Sucre. It would be cool. But meanwhile, I couldn't find Lucho. He lived up in El Alto, on one of those unnamed streets in an unnumbered house, and had no phone. The only place you could find him was at the Plaza Murillo at noon, where all the gig musicians went to get work. I went there every day for weeks, and no one had seen him. Finally, we just took the picture anyway, with someone else holding a trumpet and facing sort of away from the camera. Disguising him as Lucho was pretty unsuccessful, because Lucho is short and fat with Indian features and has missing 2 front teeth. I don't know how he played the trumpet at all, but even facing away, the guy looked nothing like him. So the record came out while I was away in Argentina for a month climbing the highest mountain in the Western Hemisphere, Aconcagua, with Kurt. I wrote Jimena a letter saying, actually, I'm quoting, I have the letter. Even if something happened to me, meaning like death, I've been happy enough in the time I've known you for a whole lifetime, and for that I feel satisfied. She never forgave me for that. Not that she said anything at the time. It was later during the divorce. So anyway, the record comes out, and the next day, there's someone from the police interrogating Jimena. Turns out the guy holding the trumpet was wanted for some crime, and the police had seen his picture in the record stores. Jimena didn't know him. I didn't know him either. She wasn't happy about that whole thing either. Couldn't see the humor in it. Before the Tiwanaku Brass, when I first came to Bolivia, I played with a pianist named Johnny Gonzalez. He was the one who introduced me to Johnny Fisher, who was a Peace Corps volunteer stationed out at Coro Coro, a copper mine. So the three of us decided to play a concert out there in Coro Coro, and I invited Luis Damut, a Puerto Rican conga player, to join us. Unfortunately, Luis could only find a toy conga. We brought Chicken Man along to tune the piano at the Mayor's, which was a half-tone flat. I don't know if you remember the White-Winged Warrior, the hero of the 1-minute radio serial out of Chicago. Chicken Man! He's everywhere, he's everywhere! Bark, 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 bark! I gave Carlos Sirwane the name Chicken Man because he was everywhere. Pretty soon, everyone was calling him that. Chicken Man. He played horn and timpani in the orchestra. He sang solos with the National Chorus. He was a conducting student of Jerry's, and he tuned pianos. But that's not all. Let me give you an example. One night, Jerry and Alberto and I are listening to a rebroadcast of an organ recital by an Austrian organist from the cathedral at San Francisco that I had missed. Halfway through, Jerry leans over and says, "Guess who's handling the extra organ stops?" Chicken Man. We spent a couple of days in Coro Coro rehearsing, and Chicken Man worked on the piano. Sunday morning, the day of the concert, there was a demonstration by campesinos from the surrounding area against the Impuesto Único, which was a fixed tax on every farmer or campesino in the country. They were very upset about it. In fact, a week earlier, the president, René Barrientos, had been stoned by a group of campesinos in Achacachi. The miners all lived in this village, but these campesinos came from miles away and none of them knew Johnny. We're interested and decide to watch. So we're standing outside Johnny's house as they come down the street chanting, "Abajo el impuesto único," down with the tax. Then when they notice us, some of them begin chanting, "Abajo el cuerpo de paz," down with the Peace Corps. And before we could really react, some of them begin throwing stones at us. We scramble to get back inside the gate in the wall, but some of them grab Luis. I have hold of his arm, and Johnny's landlord grabs me, and together, bracing our feet against the door jamb, we pull Luis inside, and then all of us get the doors shut. We're pretty shaken after that. Johnny Gonzalez is a good pianist, but he rushes like crazy. In the afternoon, we played the concert. The mayor was there, and lots of Johnny's friends from the mine. During the conga solo, Luis put his elbow through the toy drum. It was after one of those concerts in the garden at Los Portales that we met the sax player, Drazen Stachulak, and immediately asked him to join the Tiwanaku Brass. Drazen was from Yugoslavia, And sometime back in the 50s, he was touring South America with a jazz group, one of the first let out of the country by Tito. And when he got to Buenos Aires, he just took off. Eventually settled in Cochabamba, started a lumber business, and only played his sax with Music Minus One records. He was eager to play with us, so he came to La Paz or we went to Cochabamba. Our finest concert was at the Palacio de Cultura in Cochabamba. After that concert, later that night, much later, it's a little hazy. We're at some club outside under a thatched roof. There's a really crappy band playing. I think we might have played too. All of a sudden, I see the most beautiful woman in the world. She and I dance. We keep dancing. The guy she's with doesn't dance. Everything disappears, and it's just us dancing. Then she says she has to leave. I try to talk her out of it, but she says she has to. Then the nightmarish part of it. She's with an American Marine. One of those guys with stiff jaws and bayonets who guard the embassies and consulates and don't speak a word of Spanish. After that, whenever I'm in Cochabamba, I try to spot her, but I never do. I don't even know her name. After a year of great music, our pianist, René, left for Chile. He wasn't getting enough work in La Paz. So, we morphed into a Dixieland band by adding one of my climbing partners, Walter Schmiemann, a German, on banjo. Turned out Drasen played clarinet too, and Lucho could play anything. 1, 2, 3, 4. We were playing Dixieland in a restaurant the night Jimenez's water broke. It was a fancy French restaurant called Chez Henri, started by a French violinist named Henri Bittard. He was a peripatetic violinist for hire who wandered around the world talking himself into situations. He had a first prize from the Conservatoire de Paris and a very complimentary, much-folded letter from Yehudi Menuhin. He'd walked into the ministry and talked his way into being hired as concertmaster before Jerry the conductor or Alberto the director of music had even heard of it. He was a faded virtuoso who was probably pretty flashy in his time, but now was very faded, but really entertaining. He was one of these people who could no longer speak any language. He mixed French, Spanish, and English mainly, but you could hear isolated words, vestiges of countries where he'd lived. He dropped out of the orchestra after a few months and opened the restaurant. The food was very good. And Henri would come to your table and make flaming crêpes Suzettes. The first time we went there, he's showing me and Jimena the kitchen, speaking in his mangle of languages. Then he turns and says something to the cooks, who look blankly at him. And he goes, "Oh, estupide, I was hablando English to them." So I was playing, and Kurt and Jimena were having dinner when the water broke. The three of us went back to the house for a while and called the doctor. And Kurt insisted that we play the birthday song. The plan was to name him Richard II if a boy, and Sahama if a girl. Sahama is a 21,000-foot volcano out on the border with Chile, which we hadn't climbed yet. Kurt was making contingency plans. Okay, if it's a girl, we'll have to leave immediately and climb it. The pregnancy was a complete surprise. Jimena had been having nausea and stomach problems, and we just assumed it was a parasite. Parasites were a fact of life, and periodically you had to get rid of them. So she had a blood test and was picking it up on a day when I went over to Alberto's house to listen to Bartok. We listened to the concerto for orchestra and the music for strings, percussion, and celeste. Then Jimena called. She said the doctor had just looked at her and said, "Congratulations." "What for?" "You're pregnant." She said she'd be over later. I didn't say anything, but somehow Alberto knew, and he went out and got a bottle of Chivas, a big bottle. I haven't had whiskey since. We listened to the Divertimento for strings, and then the 3 piano concertos. At some point, Jimena showed up and we hugged, but still didn't say anything. I was really sick that night, but by next morning, I'd come to grips with the fact that my life had changed forever. Kurt left, and we went to the hospital around midnight. I've never been so cold in my life. Not sitting on the summits of Mount Kenya or Bolivia, or in a crevasse at 22,000 feet in the Himalayas. I was colder, shivering in a chair in Obrajes. There's no central heating in Bolivia, and the patients all had blankets. I suppose I could have asked for a blanket, but I didn't think of it. Richie was born at 11 o'clock that morning. I almost missed it. They were rolling Jimena down the corridor. She was yelling, "It's coming, it's coming." I'm fumbling with the mask, and suddenly, there he is. I've never felt anything like that moment. I went and slept for a while, and then went back to Chez Henri to play that evening. People kept gathering. People from Peace Corps, from the orchestra, from the ballet, just people I knew. Finally, we were all at Los Escudos, a huge restaurant made to look like a German beer keller. There were over 50 people in our party. We borrowed a record player from someplace and pushed the tables back and started dancing. I had bought several boxes of cigars and went to every other table in the place, handing out cigars and inviting people to join us. When they closed, Ruben and Pablo and I climbed up onto the luggage rack of a Peace Corps vehicle. And Wadman Daly, one of the assistant directors, drove us down the Prado. We were singing at the top of our lungs and laughing. And there were twice as many stars as at sea level. I wish I could freeze that moment of perfect happiness. When we got to Ruben and Claudio and Pablo's apartment, I cut my finger by accident. I'm scarred to remember the event. The next day, there was an article about me in the Society gossip column. Something about me handing out cigars. I can't believe I don't have that clipping. I have everything else. Jimena never forgave me for that night either. But oh man, throughout this, there were the mountains. Six months out of the year, there was not a cloud in the sky. And the snow was so firm it was like styrofoam. So you could cramp on up amazingly steep slopes. The rest of the year, you could ski up at Chacotaya at 17,000 feet. The road up Chacotaya had been built for a group of international scientists studying the effects of cosmic rays. And since there was a road there and a glacier next to it, someone got the idea of skiing. So, and this is true, a group of Polish engineers figured out how to build a ski lift. The problem is that the poles move with the glacier, so it had to be a flexible system. The solution, brilliant. They ran a cable around the wheel of an old Chevy, then down to a ring at the bottom of the glacier, up over the tops of open pulleys on the poles, through another ring at the top, and then in the air straight back to the Chevy. Getting attached to the cable was a scary prospect. You stood with a metal hook on a piece of rope and a belt with a large ring on it. You fed one end of the rope through the ring and grasped it with one hand. With the other hand, you put the hook on the underside of the cable and crimped it to keep it from falling off. Then you paid out the rope until the rope was taut at your waist, and with a violent jerk, you were suddenly moving up the hill. The hook was designed to ride over the pulleys with the cable, and when you got to the top, you merely let go with your other hand, and with no pressure on the hook, the cable uncrimped, and your hook and rope fell off. That was the idea. But in practice, if your rope was too short, or it got caught in your belt, or the jerk was too violent, you could be dragged nose first up the snow, or flailing over the tops of the pulleys until the other skiers yelling, "A ski lift!" got the attention of the motor man in the little shed, who was often too busy with his bottle of pisco to pay much attention. Crevasses were marked with a little flag, so you knew that either to the right of the flag or to the left of the flag there was a crevasse you might fall into. Skiers would sometimes point, but it was unclear whether they were pointing to safety or danger. I climbed mainly with Kurt, but we were always having fights. I was a rock climber and he was a hiker. So we came at the mountains from two completely divergent points of view. We were always having arguments about style and objective. The worst moment was when I forced him to try this steep ice couloir on an unclimbed peak in the Sierra Marca called Aniversario. It was early in the season and the weather was unstable. We were pretty high up this chute of ice and rotten rock when the temperature rose above freezing. And suddenly, all our ice screws melted and fell out, and from way above us, huge rocks became unglued and started flying down the couloir. We were both hit and barely managed to escape alive. Neither of us climbed for a while. It's funny, but later we became more like each other. He got more adventurous, including rowing across the Pacific Ocean. And I started liking 100-mile approaches and ultramarathons. But he died mysteriously in the desert in Egypt a few years ago, so we'll never be able to climb together again. He never reproached me for insisting on that climb. But periodically we'd have arguments and then climb with other people. I climbed with Walter Schmiemann, the banjo player. Robbie and Eric came down from New Hampshire. Dave Beckstead came down to climb, but left when Jimena and I went back to Washington for more consults on her toes. The high point was, and still is, the west face of Huayna Potosi, with 3 climbers from Dartmouth. We thought we could make it in one day, but had to stop 2/3 of the way up. We sat there all night on a ledge we'd chopped from the 55-degree ice. Down below we could hear drums from some festival. Since we'd all seen lots of Tarzan movies, we kept saying, "The drums, they're getting closer." My favorite memory, though, was a trip that I took by myself. I went out to the Juilliard Mountain Club hut, a 7-hour walk. I took only a sleeping bag and mate. When I got there, I found that the local Indians had come and dismantled the hut, taken it apart completely and carried it off. I lay on the ground laughing for about an hour. Kurt and Ted had built it out there in the Sierra Marca. It was more stuff we just disagreed about. The next day, I dropped down into that precipitous valley, past the ugly couloir on Aniversario. It was steep and dangerous, and I had no idea where I was going to come out. I didn't care. I figured I'd come to a trail or a road sometime. All day I descended that beautiful valley. Alone, the only human there. Things have been really bad between me and Jimena. We couldn't talk about anything. We couldn't make a decision together about anything. It was all nonverbal torture. Walking the streets in La Paz until dawn. Or dropping into a valley with no food and no idea where I was going. It seemed to help. I didn't care though. I didn't care about anything. I was in heaven. I just thought that's what being married entails. I mean, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. had this recording, Raphael Kubelik, Mahler Third, on a reel-to-reel tape. I used to play it for all my friends. Then in the divorce, Jimena got the tape player and most of the tapes. This one just disappeared. She wouldn't have wanted it. But anyway, I didn't hear the piece for 20 years. Till one night in New York, John Deek said, "Hey, why don't you come hear the Philharmonic tonight? We're doing Mahler Third with Raphael Kubelik." I got really excited. I love that piece. I was completely unprepared for what happened. I sobbed through the entire performance. It's the only time I've ever let myself feel that way about Bolivia and my time there. Siegfried's Idol by Wagner. We played this at Los Portales. Not this well, but it was a good performance. Whenever I've tried to explain to people what it was like playing in the orchestra in Bolivia, I'd say it was an idyll. Webster's third definition is idyll, I-D-Y-L-L, a romantic interlude. But really my whole life in Bolivia was an idyll. And I just didn't know it at the time. In the mornings, I'd drink mate in bed and play with Richie. Then I'd just practice for an hour or so. At noon, I'd pick up Julio Urquiza, the carpenter, who had his taller, his shop, on the corner. He was my best friend. An orphan of Indian parents on the Altiplano. He came to La Paz as a boy to live with an uncle, and through hard work and being smarter than everyone else, became a master carpenter and owned all his own tools. Every day we went down the hill to the high school, Don Bosco, where the orchestra performed, and played football with the janitors. I can't remember exactly how that started. I think Jerry and I were there at noon one day for something else, and noticed a pickup game going on in the courtyard of the school and joined in. On weekends, Julio and I played on a real team with Gino Bauman as goalie. After the game at Don Bosco, we'd leave Jerry and walk back up the hill. I'd have lunch, sleep, and practice some more. We rehearsed at night, and so did Jimena, who by that time was dancing with the Ballet Folklorico, since she couldn't dance on toe anymore. Luisa and Elena, the doctor's maids from upstairs, would watch Richie. The doctor, who'd never been married, was actually a lawyer, who treated us like his children, and Richie like his grandchild. He refused to rent out the apartment after we left, hoping we would come back. One night, a thief climbed over the wall from the neighbor's garden and stole all of, but only, my underpants. The doctor shot off his pistol, and the thief escaped out the gate in the hedge. The doctor had the most beautiful garden in La Paz. He would say, "Don Richard." You know what they used to say? Solían decir, el doctor Doctor Endara tiene la rosa negra. Dr. Endara has the black rose. The black rose was gone by the time we lived there, but there were lots of roses. The monkey we had for a while ate all the geraniums, but he couldn't reach the roses. He escaped one day, and I chased him over the rooftops. I stepped on one roof tile, and my leg went right through. I could look right down into somebody's room. I finally caught up to him on a high wall between two gardens. A dog was barking at him, and he was screeching at the dog. After a while, we gave him to Gitano, one of the dancers from the folkloric ballet, after he ripped out some electric wires and shorted out the whole house. Gitano said later that he taught him to dance the cueca, but I never saw it. On weekends, I would play at the Cueva de Jazz. Johnny Gonzalez had opened up this club. Whomever of the Tiwanaku Brazos would play, or I'd play with Johnny himself. It closed at 2, but if we were having fun, we'd play on till dawn. Then we'd go and eat silpanchos from a chola down the street. It's a street food, rice and vegetables wrapped up in a pancake. And since I always went to her, she became my casera and I was her casero. When the whole thing of kicking out the Peace Corps began, one night I was there with Drasen and Lucho eating silpanchos, and some drunk approached and started yelling, "Fuera los Yankees!" Out with the Yankees. So my casera grabbed her frying pan and chased the guy off down the street. The reason Peace Corps was kicked out of Bolivia was because of a movie by Jorge Sagines, Yawar Malku, Blood of the Condor. He was a friend of Alberto's and had studied filmmaking in Paris. A modest and very talented guy. He was into allegory. He'd made one very successful movie about a Blanco on La Isla del Sol, an island in Lake Titicaca, who had raped an Indian girl. It was the rape of the Indian culture by the Blanco or Spanish culture. Second movie was about a Progress Corps who opened a clinic on the Altiplano to sterilize the Indian women. More allegory. Sterilization of the Indian culture by foreign influences. Alberto composed the music, and about 10 of us from the National Symphony recorded it. There were also members of the diplomatic corps, Europeans and Americans in it. One scene is in Los Escudos. Many foreigners eating lunch. They also collected raincoats and rubber boots and obviously foreign clothes from some of my friends, and then handed them out to these children in these beautiful hand-spun clothes and beautiful homemade ponchos. But none of us knew what the plot was, so we were all excited when it came out. Kurt and I saw it together and we howled with laughter because the volunteers from the Progress Corps were so clueless and they had such bad accents. ¿Por qué no quiere vendernos estos huevos? But the ending was really violent. The Indians burned down the clinic. However, the allegory got lost in the shuffle somewhere, and articles began appearing in the newspapers alluding to sterilization clinics run by the Peace Corps out on the Altiplano. Wait a minute, that was a movie. didn't make any sense anyway, because the birth rate on the Altiplano was probably the lowest in the world. It was allegory. It was an amazing confusion of movie and reality. But it became a political reality, and the president, Jotita Torres, who obviously knew better, kicked out the Peace Corps. It probably gained him a few more months in office and added considerably to his Swiss bank account. We stayed on. We got new passports, and the doctor somehow got us entry visas. I tried to talk Kurt into staying because climbing season was coming up. He and his Bolivian girlfriend, Charito, who we'd met in Santa Cruz after the blockade, came over that night, and I thought I had him convinced. But he went home and packed and got in the plane with everyone else. When I found out he'd left, I went over to the apartment, thinking I might find Charito dead of suicide. But she was okay. Came to live with us for a while. Jerry was off in Salvador conducting, planning to come back, but never did. He got the job in Costa Rica, and everyone was going there to join him. Ruben and Claudio, Roy and Susan. A few months later, Alberto took my name to the minister to see if he could get me a salary from the orchestra. I found out later that he actually threatened to resign if they didn't hire me. But the minister just said, "Albertito, I can't do that." Of course, if I'd waited, it would have been forgotten. But it was time to leave. And a few months later, I finally realized it, and did. The problem for me, and the reason for the dreams, I guess, is because I left Bolivia, where I'd been insanely happy, before anything really bad had ever happened to me. I had that wild confidence of youth that nothing ever would, or, despite what I knew in my heart, that other places would be just as good. I must have been crazy. But I'd been in heaven for 3 long years and never recovered. Unless, by telling this story, now I'm recovered? I don't know. Does that mean the dreams will stop?